All right, so I do believe we're live. Hello, everyone. I'm Ravi Shankar. I'm representing Asia Pacific Writers and Translators in the New York Writers Workshop for the first installment of ISO Break of 2021. And we got going with the series last year. Little did we realize that a year later we would still be going with the series, but I suppose it's one of the great, side benefits of the pandemic that we are able to all get together in this kind of global fashion because we have a real treat today. We have literally writers from around the world. So we have writers from California and Australia and Singapore. Hopefully, Verena is not with us yet, but hopefully she will join us. I'm speaking to everyone from Mexico, and so it is really fabulous to be with everyone. Just those of you who are joining us and don't know much about the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, it is an organization of editors, writers, agents, translators who are interested in or based in the Asia Pacific region. And there's a conference that usually happens that moves around different cities in Asia. So previous conferences have been in Bangkok, in Thailand, in New Delhi, in Singapore, in Guangzhou, in Hong Kong. This year is supposed to be in Bangalore in November. Who knows? Maybe if things get back to normal, it still can happen. But the wonderful thing, it's a virtual network of writers. It's kind of those of you who are in the U.S. know AWP, and so it's kind of a much smaller, kinder version of AWP, is how I like to see it. And it's really an astonishing group of people, and I'm especially happy that today we have 5 fabulous women writers in celebration of both International Women's Day and Women's History Month, which is a holiday in the U.S. actually inaugurated by Jimmy Carter, who's a totally underrated U.S. president, I think. But he started it in the 1980s, and then it became Women's History Month, I think, in 1987. And so we have this whole month to celebrate women, but hopefully the idea is that it's not just this kind of symbolic platitude, but that we actually, I always, when people talk to me about racism and sexism, I always think of the statistics, right? So when you look at the discrepancy in wages between men and women, look at the rates of incarceration for people of color, these all are the actual legitimate ways to measure these things. So, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get going. But it is my pleasure to introduce, we have 4 of our 5 readers. I'm hoping the 5th will join very soon, but we have with us today Niloufar Talebi, Linda Jaivin, Jennifer Mackenzie, and Rhony Bhopla. And we're going to hear from each of them. And at the end of our reading, we open it up for a discussion. I hope that you will stay with us and we will kind of communicate and hear where everyone is and how everyone is doing. And so our first reader today is Jennifer Mackenzie. And Jennifer is a poet and reviewer. She's focused on writing from and about the Asian region. And since the publication of Borobudur, she's presented her work at a number of conferences and festivals, including Ubud, Irrawaddy, and the Massacre Writers Festival. She's been the recipient of a number of awards, including the Martin Besquet Poetry Fellowship, the Felix Meyer Traveling Scholarship from the University of Melbourne. And though she's focused on Indonesia, she's also written on China, which is a very interesting point in conjunction with another of our readers, Jaivin, which we'll get into. And she also has enjoyed a writing residency at the Seoul Art Space. She works as an occasional editor for the Lontar Foundation in Jakarta, Indonesia. I think of her as kind of as an Indonesia expert. And she's currently working on a series of dance poems and a selection of essays, Writing the Continent. And her most recent book is Navigable Ink, which came out with Transit Lounge just last year. And it's a homage to the Indonesian writer. And Jennifer will pronounce the name more properly than I will, so I'm not even going to try. Jennifer, who's the writer?
The writer is Pramudia Anantatur.
Wonderful. So thank you all for being with us. This is the first Isolation Break, a joint production of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. And without further ado, Jennifer, it's so great to hear from you.
Thank you, Ravi. It's wonderful to be here today. Firstly, I'd like to say that I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respect to elders past and present. I'm going to read today from my book, as Ravi said, which came out last year, which is Navigable Ink. And it's a homage to the, as we said, the Indonesian writer and activist Pramudia Anantatur. And this project started many years ago when I had the opportunity to translate a novel of his, which is called Aras Balik, or Cross Currents. And this novel is set in the early 16th century at the time of the Portuguese first coming to the Southeast Asian region. And so the book itself focuses on his work and his life and responds in various ways to different texts. So the first poem I'll read is based on some episodes in Aras Balik, and it's called The Messenger. The Messenger. His gold necklace and bracelet glittering under stars, his horse gleaming black in a night seeming to reach to eternity, rode along the ribbon of shoreline, anxious and ready to hear from the solitary boat moored at the dock straight ahead. He was surprised by the cold. Under a rising full moon, a breeze dancing off the waves, embracing him. Possessing a rich imagination, he compared it to the ironic action of a lover, a dismissive wave chilling the bones. Dismounting and through the gate to a yard covered in floral borders, well into the night, lamps flickered in the pendopo. "Why have you brought the cold?" drawled the Adipati. "After much obeisance, Japara has fallen, our troops retreated, Damak has been occupied by 3,000 men." His protector, looking as wild as the Shirimafuni, hissed in disbelief. "A rush of soldiers, you, sir, are detained." He sits quietly in the pendopo for some time, rises slowly, stroking his beard. The messenger also, in his rude quarters, a guard at the gate, sits quietly, terrified, outraged, with a beating heart. And I should mention for people unfamiliar with Pramudia, he was I suppose you'd say, the most significant post-independence writer in Indonesia, and he spent most of his life in prison. He was first imprisoned by the Dutch during the War of Independence, then again briefly by Sukarno, and most significantly under the new order of Suharto, and he was imprisoned in Buru Island as a political prisoner for many years, and for some time wasn't able to write. Eventually he could, but the scars, of course, of that trauma were significant. So I'll now read two poems which are a response to a documentary featuring Pramudia, actually, from the 1990s, when he was under house arrest in Jakarta. And the film is called Jalan Raya Pos, which is the Great Grand Post Road, which runs across the northern coast of Java. And that road was commissioned by the Dutch in the early 19th century and was built using forced labour. So this first poem is called Writer's Block. Typewriter, 1995. Slow click. The day passes slowly. A session of push-ups. Cleaning the yard. Making tea. Click, click, click. Writer's block. 1965. 1. Library ransacked. 2. Hysteria of flags. 3. Discourse, a burning tire. 4. Imprisonment to the east. Now, Jalan Raya Pos, winding through Chanjur's tea-growing district, so green, the sun so drenching it's near to yellow. Women under large hats, plucking buds, filling the cane baskets on their backs. VIP entourage, sirens blaring. From the fields, a soft chorus of cackling. Writer's block. Rain soaking, a breakdown. Diesel fumes rising like clouds. A rinse in the river of spare parts. The bus will rattle into life. Eventually, writer's block. Dendels as Wang puppet watching over us. If I don't feel safe, I won't leave the house. The hooded eyes see inward. Jalan Raya Pos, Governor General Dendels. Accidents, exhaustion, fatigue, hunger, miasma from the marshes, many deaths along this ribbon of road. It was a miserable short trip by bicycle, 1.5 kilometers to a friend's place. 14 years old, the Japanese came to shore, aided by the colonial atlas at Lazen. Spades, sodden, flooded, collecting sand, this rushing river, stoking the furnace at the sugar mill, from one end of the road to the other, limber bodies scale the scaffolding. Under a shelter, rain pouring down day after day, distant hills a smudge of green. Through the rain curtain, a friend brings us coffee. Guitar in smoky orange light from the lamps, clove-scented clouds. Oh, Masina, how tragic was your fate. Where was respect for those who speak up, each for his own? Look to Masina. On the road, a mudslide, on a high peak, gleaners. Brutalized, robbed, cheated of livelihood, watched for eternity, new order, their hearts and heads are no mystery. Wang performance. The puppets of Dendels, the regent of Sumedang, are cracking gamelan, battle it out, a sultry fuel, heavy night, here under the stars. Approaching the end, Jalan Raya Pos, Panarukan, shady streets. Click, click, click. I have never set foot in Panarukan. And I'll finish with the final short poem in the book called Dawn. Dawn, I take the train out of Gambir station heading east. Red mounds of earth, high as small hills, on either side of the narrow track. Farewell, what I sense of myself. On the last mound staked a shovel, a Japanese flag. Now, again the train, lurching off towards Blora, mounds smooth as mudflats, hoed, rain-washed, eroded their peaks. A chattering of bicycles and tea stalls among the mud and puddles left after rain. My skin, hoed, black-beaten, weathered, flaking away. My life. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was fabulous. And I hope
Thank
that
you.
you tell us more about your procedure and about your exposure to Indonesia when we have a chance to chat. So,
Yeah, it's great, Ravi.
hooray.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for kicking us off.
Thanks.
And welcome those of you that are just joining us. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is ISO Break. This is the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop co-production. We've been going for over a year. And perhaps we'll continue going even when things normalize, because it's been a wonderful way to bring global writers into one another's living room. So our next reader I'm very excited to have is Rhony Bhopla, who's a British Indo-American poet and visual artist, actually a fabulous visual artist who resides in California, a member of the inaugural cohort of Rooted and Written, a series of writing workshops taught by people of color for people of color. And her poems have appeared in the Consumnes River Journal, Medusa's Kitchen, Flumes, Brevities, and Tiger's Eye. The Crocker Art Museum recently featured the Indian Accent, an acrylic and collage art piece that Rhony created in a class taught by artist and activist Milton Bowens. And she's also a poetry student in the MFA program at Pacific University, and I believe almost done with her degree. Is that right, Rhony?
I'm getting close, more than halfway done.
All right, wonderful. So welcome, Rhony. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you so much, Ravi. And it's an honor to be part of this ISO Break series. It's wonderful. I'm going to read two poems. One is relatively shorter than the other. The second one is an excerpt from my long poem called Key. Between birth and death, after the Kundu of Papua New Guinea. 1. Inside tree logs, hot coals smoke, hum a Kundu drum song, burning design by etch of song, sour wind and sun-split sand, rub on mud-colored palette for a Kundu, whose middle belly carves with perfect coals, heat and wood, music to ritual lair, hot hiss lair, snake and lizard beware. 2. Goat hide for voice of tabla and daga, stretched, hollowed for tap and hit tone dong. Flat hand pound on tabla and fingertip daga, tip tip dong. Take this iron smear to ink the tabla, blat, flap, nipple, resonant, daga, goat, gift. The dark, fast, round sound, black iris on skin, tap on rims, the smell of ink. 3. Between the pause of the funeral tabla, a father in the next room says goodbye to the bride, full of red and embroidery, draped in the silk from the dead chest of her grandmother next door, whose naked hand is pulled out from a bracelet. A child passes between the rooms to give the goodbye gift to the father of the bride, who is also the son of the dead grandmother. He sees his mother one last time and his daughter, and they play the wedding beat of the Kundu drum. Ghee, an excerpt. Drop of these sari balloons cobalt across the river. Men in lungis ready pyres with precision. Tiered diyas light the way for floating petals. My mother remembers fragments of the Mahabharata, mostly the moment when Krishna rescued Draupadi. Her voice trembles as she describes the rape. I learned the text years ago. My mother's motionless eyes uncertain. Reverie, the flute player avatar, only guilty of stealing milk as a child. Never having held the text, she recites it for me again. Gopis applaud in the distance. When she was 8 years old, my mother made rotis on the open fire, squatting in her sandals, obeying my grandmother's commands. She took turns with my aunt. Nani said, "Twadi jimedari hon hagia." It is your responsibility now. A perfect wheel sizzled on the wood-fired flame. The family of 10 formed a survival camp. It was 1948. I asked, did they take you to the camps in Pakistan? Where did you go when the orders came? The cows were left behind, she said. We left with just our clothes, she said. She never heard nor understood Nehru's speech. She was 8, running in the gullies, learning Urdu, making lines in the earth with her bare feet. I asked, how was your life after you left New Pakistan? Did you have a house? Did you like it in India? My mother answered, before we had many nokar. They cooked for us. When a meal is prepared, it must be drenched in ghee, making it superior and then edible for our family. We had ghee, and we ate it as it fell from our hands. The corners of our lips became full, our mouths bright yellow. We could not afford nokar in Nurmal, so we learned how to milk cows, make ghee, wash clothes like dobis, clean the house. It was a huge house left behind by a Mussulman. My mother's father was respectfully called Bauji, long vowels strung together. His hair turned white the moment bloodshed began between the Muslims and the Hindus. Bauji became the leader in that new home in Nurmal, east of the new border. He tied the knots between uneven sides, remained silent during cries. His eyes drooped under hope. Yet in Nurmal, street chai was perfectly brewed. His pocket was full enough for a week. Bauji died in a street. He took a step onto a bus and fell. And that's all we were told. That's all my mother heard of her father's death. My mother knows things. Mothers know things like making salve with brilliant orange sweet potato. Once peeled, placed on your lips, the pressure takes away the guilt of having kissed too many. When I cry, she laughs, and then I become angry. I become strong. Mothers know things. In the spare room of her old house, I found a print of Jawaharlal Nehru and John F. Kennedy. One was spinning the globe on its axis, the other simply laughing. I liked the image because someone had won, it seemed. You can have it, my mother said. I unhooked the frame from the wall, cleared a line of dust from the glass, left it on the bed and came back, put it back on the wall. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rhony. It's really fabulous. I've read your work before, and to hear how it's evolved is wonderful. So thank you for sharing that with us. And hopefully when we chat, we can talk about the connections between text and textile and your visual art and your written work as well. So welcome, everyone. Those of you that are just joining us, I'm Ravi Shankar. This is ISO Break, a co-production of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. And I should also mention, if you're interested, you can look at apwriters.com, and there actually is a book that was published, Meridian. I think that Jennifer might have a copy that she can hold up when we have our little communication, but it's a great sample and representation of the kind of talent that we have. And it's available through SPD, Small Press Distribution in the US, and through the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators website in Australia and the rest of the world. So I'm so excited to have our next reader who has just joined us, and I'm glad that the timing was fine. A little loud. I don't know what the background noise is.
Does that help? Or
okay.
Yes.
Might be a little bit better. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
So next up, we have a Singapore-based writer, editor, storyteller, and theater practitioner, Verena, who's published 2 collections of short stories, Spaces, and Spectre, and 4 volumes of plays, as well as edited 12 story anthologies. An honorary fellow at the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, he was writer in residence at Nanyang Technological University through 2018 and holds 3 master's degrees. Wow, you're really a masochist, Verena, in English literature, voice studies, and creative writing. She's currently completing a PhD in creative writing with Swansea University, through which she's writing her first novel about 3 generations of Singaporean Chinese women with a mythological lair. And I love the way that she describes it. Imagine Amy Tan meets Neil Gaiman. So wonderful to have you, Verena. Thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me this morning. Thank you, APWT, for inviting me to this event. All right, I'm going to read you an extract from my novel In the Making. That Ravi mentioned just now as a kind of Amy Tan versus Neil Gaiman. Right, so you have to imagine yourself in Singapore, in Chinatown, in a particular street called Sego Lane, on January 16th, 1970. Duati is the central character, and she's an old woman. Amidst the dust and dirt and peeling paint and plaster of the 5-foot way between a coffin maker and a funerary goods store, Duati sat half-crouched on a low stool, her back facing the staircase leading up to the rented cubicle spaces above the shops. Beside her, half blocking the staircase doorway, was a small, crude wood case bag, elevated slightly above the floor on foldable struts. The bag was open, the inner lid lined with rows of pendants and earrings. The base contained bangles, rings, and unset stones. However, she was preoccupied with things other than peddling cheap jade to passers-by. As the setting sun cast long shadows on the street, Duati listened keenly to the Cantonese storytelling emanating from the radiofusion set high above boxes of incense and paper goods in the store to her left. Lam Suk, Wong Tai Tai, what did Wu Song say? I don't understand, asked Duati eagerly in broken Cantonese. Old Lam, seated at the foot of the half-shuttered coffin shop, said in Cantonese accident Hokkien, Pan Jing Lian, you are guilty of cheating on and killing my brother. You deserve to die. He stopped whittling his piece of wood, turned towards Duati, and mock-stabbed her in the neck with his knife. He dropped the knife, clutched his throat, staunching, spurting blood, and then expired in a choking fashion. No! Exclaimed Duati. Be quiet and listen, shushed Mrs. Wong, the proprietress next door, as she folded paper ingots by her storefront. For the next few minutes, the three sat enthralled while the storyteller narrated Wu Song fighting and slaying Seaman Ting, the playboy who destroyed his sister-in-law's virtue and gave her the poison to murder his brother Wu Dalang. All too soon, the story was over. As the program theme song warbled over the cable radio, Mrs. Wong shook the sack of folded ingots to settle its contents, saying, That was nice, but maybe they should be telling another kind of story at this time. Chinese New Year is coming. Lunar New Year or no Lunar New Year, this storyteller is good, said old Lam, then his eyes twinkling. Eh, you like my execution of Pan Jing Lian just now? Very well, replied Mrs. Wong. Better than the statues in Tiger Balm Gardens. You should star in Hong Kong movie. You know, as a boy, I was almost apprenticed under the great opera master. But why did a beautiful woman like Pan Jing Lian have to die? Interjected Duati, breaking her silence. Her face was filled with utter disappointment. You never heard this story from the water margins before? Asked old Lam. I have. Bewildered with Tuati's answer, old Lam looked at Mrs. Wong for a response. Mrs. Wong picked up the cue. What nonsense! Pan Jin Lian deserves her fate. But she was forced to marry the ugly dwarf Wu Daliang, argued Tuati. There was no feeling in the marriage. She had to look for love elsewhere. Only a loose woman will try to seduce her brother-in-law. She couldn't help herself. Wu Song is so handsome compared to his older brother. But she couldn't help falling into the arms of Simon Ting. She was tricked into having an affair with him. Trick or no trick, love or no love, Pan Jin Lian is still a flirt and an adulterer. Such people always meet with a bad end. That's how the old stories always go. But stories can be changed, right? Asked Tuati hopefully. Mrs. Wong and old Lam did not answer. Surely stories can be changed? Asked Tuati again, this time hesitantly. All stories go one way. If you change something else, it's not the same story anymore, muttered old Lam, sweeping up the wood shavings around his seat. Mrs. Wee, said Mrs. Wong, you have very interesting ideas. Look at the time, it's late. I must go and cook dinner. She brought the sack of folded ingots within, turned off the rediffusion set, and proceeded to close the shutters of her shop. And now for the second piece, I will be reading a poem I wrote a few months ago. And it's in celebration of old age. Dying. The stylist lifts, lets fall, proclaiming judgment on white against black. You should die. Mindless before authority. I submit. Thus begins a 25-year sentence, imprisoning honest age. Condemned behind youthful bars, my body riots, roams roots different from where will prefers to remain. Week by week, month on month, year after year, quietly, black becomes grey, grey becomes white, until one day a mirrored snowhead screams at black remains, you should die! Why do we linger at the start, when the journey ahead is what life's all about? There's nothing wrong with white, cool as cotton, unlike youth's scratchy polyester. It's merely a signpost towards the end we must reach, a badge reflecting wisdom gained along the way. So why remain at the beginning and die a dark-haired babe? Instead of mourning, let's thrash that jail, flaunt our souvenirs, and party till the lights go out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verena. I love the animated nature of your reading, and hopefully you'll tell us more about your novel when we have a chance to chat. Wonderful to hear you. And those of you who are just joining us again, I'm Ravi Shankar. This is ISO Break, the 8th edition. It's a collaboration between the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. And I should say briefly about the New York Writers Workshop. There are some terrific teachers who teach writing classes all around the world. You can see it online. And I should also mention that there is an immersive writing workshop happening in Kathmandu, in January. And you can look at details on the New York Writers Workshop homepage. We have writers such as Kim Adenizio, Yutsu Sharma, a number of writers who are going to be part of this program, and hopefully things open up enough that we'll all be able to participate. So without further ado, I am really overjoyed to introduce our next reader, Niloufar Talebi, old friend of mine and an author, award-winning translator, and interdisciplinary artist and producer. She's the editor and translator of Belonging, New Poetry by Iranians Around the World, and the author of a fabulous hybrid memoir, Self-Portrait in Bloom, and the creator of Abraham in Flames, which was an opera inspired by the life and work of Ahmad Shamlou, one of Iran's most important poets. Her work has been published in World Literature Today, the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, Poetry International, PBS Frontline, The Margins, and the Michigan Quarterly Review. And her projects as a librettist have been commissioned and presented at Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Stanford Live, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And you can check her out online at niloufar.net. So thank you so much for joining us, Niloufar. It's so wonderful to have you. And please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be invited by you and the APWT and the New York Writers Workshop to read along my co-readers today from all over the world. I wish I owned niloufar.net, but I don't, because I'm not the only Niloufar in the world, I think. Actually, I should check and see. My website's actually niloufartalebi.net. But anyhow, I'm going to read a selection, an excerpt from the memoir, the hybrid memoir that Ravi mentioned. It's Self-Portrait in Bloom. And just to give a little background on the excerpt that I'm reading, so Self-Portrait in Bloom is a hybrid memoir in that it is a memoir, but also it sort of sits at the intersection of biography as well, biography of the great Iranian poet Ahmad Shamlou that Ravi mentioned. It's also sort of a cultural meditation. It's also a sort of a treatise and an interrogation of the politics of translation. And it's sort of a historical record of Iran, the country that my parents come from and where I grew up a little bit for a few years, and on and on. So it's a very sort of hybrid situation here. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 10, which is called The Master and Margarita. And the background to this chapter is that Ahmad Shamlou, who was born in 1925 and passed away in the year 2000, was one of Iran's great poets of the 20th century. He is one of the, usherers in of the modernist poetic movement in Iranian culture and literature, and he is one of the people who was sort of responsible for taking Iranian poetics from how it started to break with classical forms all the way to its free verse, really. So he really modernized. He was part of the group who modernized Iranian poetics. When I lived in Iran for a few years after the revolution between 1980 and 1984, I was lucky that he was friends with my parents, and Ahmad Shamlou would visit our parents' sort of literary salons and readings and artistic gatherings. So I, as a young woman, between the ages of 11 and 15, I had the pleasure of having this incredible influence very near to me. When I moved to the United States and I was studying comparative literature, it coincided when I was learning, really understanding that I am really to be a writer. He was on his lecture and speaking tour in 1990 and 1991. And I met with him a few times and attended his lectures. And he came to see me once as I was in the pangs of sort of transformation into a writer. And another person that's going to be referred to in this chapter is his third wife, who was also his muse, his wife, his assistant, and now the steward of his work. Her name is Ida. The Master and Margarita. During his 1990-1991 visit, Shamlou told me that I reminded him of Margarita in Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. I was riveted, flattered. Margarita. She immediately acquired iconic status in my mind. This is before I knew that Margarita was the full name of the diminutive Gretchen, the female character in Goethe's Faust, from which the Master and Margarita builds. I took the mention as a recommendation, but a summary of the Master and Margarita revealed almost nothing of Margarita, and since the synopsis didn't entice me, I did not read the book then. Over the years, I would page through the book if I spotted a copy at a bookstore, the charge that I should read it on my mind. But continuing to find it unappealing, I would reshelf it. This went on for 2 decades, until I recently convinced myself that listening to its audiobook on my daily walks would be my chance to unearth the mysterious key to understanding my character as seen through the poet's eyes, as if Shamlu's likening me to Margarita were somehow a riddle, an oracle bestowed upon me until I had the readiness to receive it. And so I declared myself ready. The novel weaves 2 fantastical settings, that of 1930s Moscow, where Satan appears to hold his ball, causing all manners of disarray, and of the Jerusalem of Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator of Judea, and the Passion of Christ. Because I knew Margarita would not appear until the latter half of the book, I persisted through the complex plot, curious as to why this book was a masterpiece of the 20th century. Without detracting from the story-weaving gymnastics of the book and the story's intricate architecture and what it meant for Bulgakov to write it in his time, I was otherwise frustrated that reading this book was not a transformative experience for me. I was glad to learn more about Bulgakov's life and his fraught relationship with Stalin, as well as the novel's numerous false starts since 1928, its obstacles including Bulgakov's burning his manuscript, as Master famously learns in the novel that manuscripts don't burn, long hiatuses and several restarts, the publication of a censored version in 1966 in Russia, and finally the smuggling to Paris of the entire manuscript and publication in 1967 in its first full edition by a publisher of banned books. Margarita is the devoted lover of Master, the novel's hero, a writer whose grief from the rejection in a communist country of his novel about Christ and Pontius Pilate lands him in an insane asylum. Bored in her passionless marriage, Margarita takes a leap of faith and leaves behind her old life to join Satan and his retinue. As reward for acting as the hostess of Satan's grand ball, naked no less, and welcoming historical figures from hell, Satan grants her reunion with Master. She sets up house and a writing studio for the still distraught Master, and in the end, they are further rewarded with living a life of limbo rather than death. I felt increasingly uneasy as the story of Margarita unfolded. She was powerless. She was a powerless, sexualized shadow, a male fantasy, a devotee revolving around the son of Master. Is this what Shamlu thought I was or was to become? A muse to an enabler of a male artist? Was he projecting the version of his idealized muse assistant onto me? Was he laying the psychological groundwork for me to become a devoted planet orbiting the sun of a male artist? I tried to interpret Margarita differently, but I could not. No matter how I sliced things, this was a book by a man about a male hero in a world of male icons, casting a pure and acquiescent woman as a supporting figure, reducing her to a naked muse and selfless mistress. I was reading the book at the time of 2007 Me Too and 2018 Time's Up movements, which happened to coincide with my own awakening to the systematized way we women have been trivialized at the hands of male storytellers who shape a version of women and man, for that matter, who shape a version of woman and man, for that matter, in our imaginations, which is far from reality and stripped of our totality. I was awakening to how I had played a supporting role to my own spouse, just as Lee Krasner had done to Jackson Pollock, Alma to Gustav Mahler, women who relinquished their own lives and artistry for the expected care of their men. And as Ida had spent her life supporting the ecosystem necessary for Shamlo to meet his challenges, even if she were not giving up a creative career of her own, a potential that will never be known. The magic spell of that characterization I safeguarded for so many years was broken. I wonder if Shamlu understood me. I think I'll stop here, Ravi. There's a little bit more to go, but I think I'll stop here. If I have time, I could read a very short poem by Shamlu in my translation, because part of what's hybrid about the book is that it also contains an entire book-length selection of Shamlu's work in my translation in it. Do I have time to read a short?
You do, yes. And
okay.
Can you read it in Farsi and English?
I knew you would ask.
All right.
So here it is. Okay, so this is Shamlu and Ida met in the early 1960s in Tehran. They were neighbors for a while, and it's a very, very romantic story on how they came to spend time together and fall madly in love, which I write about in the book, in Self-Portrait in Bloom. I thought it would be really interesting. There was many ways, of course, that I could present this hybrid book to you through so many lenses. But since we are a panel of all writers who are all of the female persuasion, and since Ravi has mentioned that Women's National History Month, is that right? Or Women's History Month, I thought that I would sort of focus on that little bit in my book. Of course, I have an enormous amount of respect for Ahmad Shamlu, and we all owe a great debt to him for being such an amazing, pioneering, iconoclastic poet and cultural figure. But at the same time, I think that as we get older, we cast a much more human gaze onto the people that we have idolized, and we're able to sort of connect with them on a more personal level. So that's why I thought it was very interesting it might be interesting to you for me to read how my perception of his mentioning of Margarita and me morphed over the years as I got older. So here's a very short poem. It's about his meeting Ida, who became his third wife. And there's a really beautiful recording of Ida actually reading this poem in her own voice, which I found to be just beautiful. Shamlu himself has read many, many of his poems, and you can find them just by Googling him. He has a beautiful voice and a beautiful way to read. So I'll read it in English first, I think, and then I'll read it in the Persian. Song of Acquaintance. Who are you that I so trustingly confide my name to, hand the keys of my home to, share the bread of my joy with, sit by whose side, at whose knees, and so peacefully sleep? Who are you that I so solemnly linger with in the country of my dreams? سرود آشنایی. کیستی که من این گونه به اعتماد نام خود را با تو میگویم، کلید خانه‌ام را در دستت میگذارم، نان شادی هایم را با تو قسمت میکنم، به کنارت مینشینم و بر زانوی تو این چنین آرام به خواب میروم. کیستی که من این گونه به جد در دیار رویاهای خیش با تو درنگ میکنم. Thank you.
Oh, so wonderful. And that Persian just gives me the chills when I hear it. Thank you so much, Niloufar. And that is from your hybrid memoir, Self-Portrait in Bloom. Hold it up for us, would you? Yes. Excellent.
That is it. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, everyone.
All right, wonderful. Those of you that are just joining us, again, I'm Ravi Shankar. This is ISO Break, a co-production of the New York Writers Workshop and the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. I've mentioned a couple of times a few things I'll mention again. If you're interested in APWT, you should look at their website, try to become a member. There is an anthology called Meridian that has a selection of both emerging and established writers from around the world. And New York Writers Workshop is running a fabulous immersive writing retreat in Kathmandu, Nepal in January. You can find details on the New York Writers Workshop website, and hopefully some of you could join us. So thank you all. We're up to our final reader, and after we hear everyone, I hope you'll stay with us for a conversation, because this is really a very special occasion to have all women writers, and also from around the world, from Australia, from Singapore, from the US. So I really need to get out of the way and just listen to the women speak. And our last reader of the night, last but not least, is the fabulous Linda Jaivin, the author of 12 books, 7 novels, including the quarterly essay Found in Translation. And I need to mention her forthcoming book, The Shortest History of China, which is out in Australia in May, in the US in September, and around the world. And I know this is a project she's been working on for a while. So I'm very excited to have our final reader of the night, Linda Jaivin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ravi, and thank you, APWT and the New York Writers Workshop. Really, really happy to be here. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people, which has never been ceded, and I am going to read to you today from my last novel, The Empress Lover, and it's a scene from the beginning, and it has one of my favorite women characters, Mrs. Jin. Naku Naku, the landlady of the courtyard house where I rent my rooms, speaks 2 words of English. They're both knock. Another foreign woman who lived here before me taught Mrs. Jin the phrase knock knock, but Mandarin doesn't have any syllables that end with K, so she slips a U in at the end and makes it into Naku Naku. It amuses her so much that she rarely lets a day pass without booming out Naku Naku at my doorway on some pretext or another. Qing Jin, I hollered back. Come on in, the door's open. The door was always open. The lock was broken. Mrs. Jin kept saying she'd get someone in to fix it, but she didn't trust tradesmen. It's not like the old days, she said to me the other day when I reminded her about it. Chinese people used to be honest and hardworking. Now, everywhere you look, it's crooks, liars, and scammers. You can't trust anyone. You don't understand this because you're a foreigner. Your brain works differently. You're not nearly as complicated as we Chinese. We're very complicated. China is very complicated. The word she used was fuza, which to my mind always seemed to cast a haze over people or situations it described and turn them into murky landscapes full of shadows and hidden dangers. I once told her that I was also complicated. She laughed and shook her head, but I was complicated enough. To make a long story short, the door to my wing in the little courtyard house I shared with Mrs. Jin in Beijing wasn't getting fixed anytime soon. It wasn't important. The main entry to the house, the door to the street, was deadlocked and guarded with a security grill. And that was the important thing. And even had my door locked, Mrs. Jin would have had no compunction about coming in and rifling through my stuff whenever she felt like it. The old cliche, there's no word for privacy in Chinese. That's not exactly true, of course, but like everything else here, it was complicated. As she stamped the snow off her feet on the mat outside, thump, 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 I looked up from the notebook in which I was writing and I checked the time. It wasn't yet 10 in the morning, a tad on the early side for Mrs. Jin's daily drop-in. I was seated on my ta, a faux Ming platform bed. A ta was the Swiss army knife of the furniture world. It looked simple, a deep platform covered with a tatami mat and walled in on 3 sides with a low headboard and 2 arms. But it served, at least for me, as a bed, sofa, workstation, dining room, bookshelf, and storage. It could possibly open bottles too. I'd never tried. I bought it in the first flush of enthusiasm upon returning to live in China for the first time in 20 years. Mrs. Jin had been bemused by the purchase. Like many middle-class Chinese, she shopped at IKEA. Convinced that I had the words, "Rip me off, I'm a foreigner," tattooed on my forehead, her immediate reaction was to interrogate me as to how much I'd paid for the thing. So I lied, naming an amount equal to roughly half of what I actually spent. "Wow," Mrs. Jin had cried in shock and disapproval. "That's so expensive. You were ripped off. You should have told me you wanted a ta. I have a friend who sells them." Whatever you needed, Mrs. Jin had a friend who sold it. But really, why would you want a ta? She screwed up her face. Isn't that thing awfully uncomfortable? Awfully uncomfortable? Didn't come close, but I was never going to admit it. "It's the most comfortable thing in the world, Mrs. Jin. Seriously, you should get one," I'd said. "It makes me feel like an empress. You won't find me sitting anywhere else." She laughed. "You don't have anywhere else to sit." "That's because I spent all my money on this damn ta." "Was I?" Mrs. Jin laughed. "You're more Chinese than the Chinese." "Oh, Shigan," I'd replied. I wouldn't be so bold, but her words made me happy. The door creaked this morning as Mrs. Jin pushed it open. That was another thing, but I figured that as long as the door remained unlocked, it might as well keep it squeak. So should a thief ever really manage to jump our courtyard wall in the night and try to get into my wing, I'd wake up and have time to, I don't know, hide under the ta. A blur of white streaked past her legs. "Mimi," cried Mrs. Jin. "It's okay," I assured her. I liked the cat, which had already ducked under the ta as if showing me how it was done. Mrs. Jin was small and round, and on this morning she resembled a tomato in her red padded jacket, green fringed scarf, and matching beanie. "Looking good, Mrs. Jin." She grinned and patted her beanie, as if to pass all the credit onto it and it alone. With the toe of her padded black corduroy shoe, she snugged the floral cloth snake back over the crack at the bottom of the thin wooden door. This is what incited by the snub, the desperado wind banged at the door and scrabbled at the wall of latticed windows, trying to get in. "This is what it's like living in a courtyard house," Mrs. Jin remarked. "Are you sure you're able to cope with it?" I've been living in her house for 5 years already, and she asked me this whenever Beijing weather did what Beijing weather does to courtyard houses: dump snow, hurl sand, bake and stifle, scatter leaves, and blow icy wind through the cracks, never neglecting to deposit a layer of whatever was in the Beijing air on every surface. "Yes, I'm used to it by now," I answered, then deadpan. "And you?" "I was born here," Mrs. Jin shrugged. Her family, a distant branch, more like a twig, of the Qing dynasty's imperial clan, had originated in the even colder climes of the northeast. They'd been Manchu bannermen, part of the military, political, and social nobility that the Qing court had allowed to drift into creative languor on generous pensions until the dynasty collapsed in 1911. By the time Mrs. Jin's father was born in 1926, the family's fortunes had fallen, and not nearly so graciously as in that early great novel of Bannerman Decay, The Dream of the Red Chamber. Her grandfather, who changed his Manchu surname to Jin in 1911 to avoid being beaten up or worse by the revolutionary anti-Qing mobs raging around the city, pulled a rickshaw. Her grandmother rolled the family's heirlooms one by one inside rags of rough cotton. There were precious jades and scrolls, ornate cricket cages, and even the embroidered badges from their ancestors' court robes. She carried them to the antique dealers south of the city's Chenmen Gate. The merchants were wily, but apparently, and not surprisingly, no match for Mrs. Jin's grandmother, even in her desperate state. When he was 20 and civil war broke out, Mrs. Jin's father joined the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Party, and eventually rose to a respectable rank in the military. In turn, at the start of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, Mrs. Jin, who was 16, joined the Red Guards and helped to ransack her own home, which was then sealed off, effectively confiscated. Eventually, she came into repossession of it via spider-webbed post-Mao mercantile machinations that she had once explained to me in such intricate detail that I was unable to retain a single thread of it. Mrs. Jin was a retired functionary of the Bureau of Statistics, widowed and merrily so. I took it that the late Mr. Jin, who'd taken her surname for, again, that word, complicated reasons, had been something of a bore. I saw your soldier friends were here again last night, I remarked as Mimi crept into sight, and seeing her chance, bounded up onto the ta to settle in my lap, hooking her claws into my jumper and pulling up threads. Mrs. Jin giggled like a schoolgirl. Hope we weren't too loud. Her friends, many of them old Red Guards like herself, had as usual shouted themselves hoarse, playing drinking games and bellowing old revolutionary songs into the microphone of her bass-challenged karaoke machine. I could hear the pealing of their laughter at what were no doubt wildly off-color jokes and political impersonations. The noise had swept through the courtyard in great waves, rattling my windows like the wind. I didn't hear a thing, I said. Did you have fun? Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, and leaving us wanting more, Linda. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So I'm Ravi Shankar. I'm going to bring everyone else back in. This is ISO Break, a collaboration between the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. It's a monthly reading series that showcases members of APWT. And this was one of the best readings, I have to say. And we had 5 fabulous women writers with us today from around the world, from Singapore, from Australia, from California. And so let's have a collective hand for everyone. Thank you so much for that. Wonderful work. So fabulous. And the reading series will be archived. You should be able to see it on YouTube. I am hearing a little bit of feedback from somewhere, but we're going to just open it up to a discussion. And this special ISO break is for International Women's Month and Women's History Month and International Women's Day. And so I wanted to start with that. Since we have 5 female writers from around the world who probably have dealt with various forms of sexism or other forms of, I just want to know, from where you come from, what has it been like to be a female writer? I mean, what have been some of the positive things, some of the negative things, some of the obstacles, some of the things that you've had to overcome? I would love to hear. Maybe we could start there. We just go around and have each of you talk about what it's been like to be a female practitioner of the literary arts. So if anyone wants to take that, we could just kind of go forward from there. Is there anything? I mean, I know in the U.S. there's an organization, VITA, that does a count of women writers versus men writers and male writers, and of course, it's heavily skewed in terms of male writers, and so there is this kind of inherent sexism that exists in society that's also replicated in letters as well. So I would be very interested to hear your take on all of this. Anyone want to jump in?
I can jump in.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'm coming from the perspective of, I'm over 50 and I went back to school and started my MFA. And I think I made a conscious effort when I select my bibliography each semester. It must be at least 50% women. That's something that I purposely have built into my studies. And they must be contemporary writers, because I think that helps me understand where I place myself as a writer. I do understand that there's the buzzword is the canon that we refer to, and we try to learn the traditions and, but I feel that as an artist, it's important for me to know what current writers are doing and also women writers are doing in literary art. So I've made a conscious effort to kind of push back against any type of marginalization in the literary arts.
Yeah. And Niloufar, I know that in your excerpt from Self-Portrait in Bloom, you had this great passage where you talked about male representations of females and male storytellers kind of giving their version of femininity. I mean, would you like to speak to this at all?
Sure. I think this is the great thing about getting older, especially for women. Um, just, in the past few years, 5 years, I've grown so much more into my own skin. And while I was writing this book, it took about 7 years to do the book and its accompanying opera. I went through so many different transformations. And, I'd always felt that I was being slighted, that the respect and the space that I was getting was not commensurate with my talents and with my efforts. But I really didn't really know how to relate to it. I didn't really know how to respond to it, and I didn't really know how to push back. But I mean, even in the chapter that I read there, I skipped a few paragraphs, but I mean, I immediately talk back to men who try to say anything over me or anything to me, which happens on a daily basis from woke men. It's just sort of part of their speaking that they just start to mansplain or they interrupt. So I don't have any problems with doing that anymore. And, Rhony, it's very interesting that you said that as you construct your curriculum. About 4 years ago, as I was sort of going through this awakening, I started reading, how we read the canon, and the canon's Kafka and Hemingway and, every man in the world who wrote. And I started, and I allude to it here in the little paragraphs in the short paragraphs that I skipped, but that growing up, our sense of self was sort of constructed through those very minimized and skewed representations of women in those books, not knowing it. And it's only the past 4 or 5 years where I very consciously, I've probably read 98% women. And I audiobook a lot because I walk a lot. So I read fast because I can audiobook, and I'm a very slow reader. So I'm reading maybe about 10, 15 books a month or something like that. And they're all women, and they're contemporary women mostly. It's absolutely changed my life. Not only am I getting, I'm sorry to say this, but I'm getting better literature. I'm getting literature that's much more textured. It's much more interesting. It's much more multidimensional. To my sensibility, but I'm also getting to connect with just a world that could very well just be comprised of female writers. I'm missing nothing reading only female writers. So I do have to say that I've read Rabi Alameddin's, he is a male writer, but his book, The Unnecessary Woman, or An Unnecessary Woman, is a masterpiece. And so he is one non-female writer that I've enjoyed. But I don't know if I really responded to your specific question, but it's just been about this transformation that's been absolutely life-altering.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you did. I mean, it's such a complicated subject in some ways because there's an intersectional quality as well, right? I mean, when we talk about femininity, there's also this race and class component, and I think about in the U.S., I think over 50% of American women voted for the former president, whose name I shall not mention. So it is this very kind of rich, complicated conversation, but I'd love to throw it to those in Australia and Singapore. What is it like being a female writer in these places? Verena, Jennifer, Linda.
Well, I've been a feminist since I was a really, really young girl, and I have to acknowledge that at the time that I was growing up and becoming a journalist first and then a writer, I was mentored by a lot of very wonderful men who really did their best to, help push my career forward. And I have to acknowledge that. And I love women writers. There's a lot of women writers I absolutely adore, but I wouldn't stop reading men because, well, I just think I get a lot out of both. But in my own work, I do something where, for example, if I'm writing a profile or doing a piece of journalism or an essay, I rather sneakily try to quote most or all women experts, because there's always women authorities or women who are worth quoting in that mix, and superior quotes, can always be found. And so I do that. I like to mentor younger women writers. I totally agree with Niloufar about having absorbed all this kind of stuff. When you're younger, you're like, oh, well, that's what a woman character does. And then you have to unlearn all that. Absolutely. I totally identify with that. So I like mentoring young women. I like quoting women all the time, whenever possible. And in my shortest history of China, I've brought all these women who are usually not part of the, if you're doing a short general history of China, you won't find as many women as I've. So if I have to profile, for example, if I profile, for example, 2 inventors, one of them is going to be a woman, and one that most people haven't heard of, and yet she's not insignificant. There's a little temple to her in Shanghai, for example, and when I talk about the ancient oracle bones, I use the example of a woman's life, a woman who came to her marriage with a king with her dowry of an army. And it was buried in her own tomb with battle axes, with her battle axes. And, this is the sort of thing that I try to do very consciously as a feminist and as somebody who wants to see other women rise.
Jennifer, do you want to add to that, being in Melbourne?
Yes, well,
Indonesia, is there anything that you want to add?
yes, well, like Linda, I had some wonderful male mentors when I started writing, but I certainly experienced the opposite. For example, there was one particular chap who, years later, I ran into him, and he said to me right out of the blue, "Oh, I never liked your poetry." He said, "It was all that feminist stuff." And it was kind of bewildering that someone would say that maybe 20 years later. But generally, I think also I tend to be about a 50-50. If I'm looking at my reviews that I've done, usually it's about 50-50 male, female. But it's a lot of, because I focus on Asia, just to keep it contained, I guess, it's a lot of the women writers that I'm really enjoying. Last year, I read Sridevi Iyer's novel, which I think is absolutely wonderful. Leila Hudori, Intan Paramadita in Indonesia. There's so many wonderful writers coming out of Asia. So I probably will be reviewing or looking at more of those as things go on.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Verena, how about you in Singapore? How are things being a female writer?
I think, as far as I understand, in Singapore, there are actually more women being published, especially in long form, in novels, right, rather than men. And men seem to be doing all the be more notable for poetry. So I don't know why that trend is, or maybe that is replicated elsewhere. I'm not sure, but that seems to me to be the case in Singapore. Yeah.
How interesting. Do you have any theory about why that might be the case?
Maybe perhaps stories are told by women more. Or maybe women have more the personality or the aptitude to tell longer forms. I really have no idea. Yeah.
Sorry, Verena, go ahead.
So in terms of trying to respond as a woman to the world and all that, with relating to my novel. So it's based on a nugget of family history, and it's all on the women's side of things. But the Neil Gaiman aspect of it is that, okay, the whole idea of the novel is 3 generations of Singapore Chinese women with a mythological layer. So the mythological layer is the story of these 3 women kind of is interrelated with 3 Chinese goddesses. And in a sense, while I love American gods, it is very male. And it's also dealing very much from the very patriarchal male gods. So it was a deliberate choice to interweave Chinese goddesses into the story rather than male goddesses, male gods.
Wonderful, fascinating. Thank
Ravi,
you.
I think it's also worth talking about race a little bit.
Yeah.
Especially in light of what's just been happening here with the terrorist attack on Asian women, East Asian women, Far Eastern women. I think, you know, if you were asking earlier whether I felt how we feel as female writers in our milieus, I feel that I imagine most of the slights to me, most of my being marginalized has to do with my, I guess, race. I want to call it race because, I mean, I'm on some spectrum of somewhere on that spectrum, probably looking more on one end than the other. But I think still in relation to one end of the spectrum, I think I'm much more marginalized in that sense, in the sense that I have a different perspective that's not perhaps as that's more multi-layered as some other perspectives, or that it's so different. And so I think as a person who also translates a lot and whose work I consider my work, all of it, writing, theatrical works, opera, translation, all of it cultural translation, because I feel like there's got to be some way to invite people into the mix so that they are finding, so that we're reducing, all of us here are artists. So what we're doing is we're reducing our experiences to their most distilled, that all of us could relate to. So we're writing the truths of humanity, whatever the surface of it is, whether it's based in Bombay or the story is based in some extraterrestrial planet. We're just trying to get to the humanity of it. So I feel that race othering has played a little bit more in my own estimation of my own marginalization than my gender, I think. I don't know about other people.
Interesting. Anyone want to respond to that? Rhony?
I just agree. I mean, you know, you're just a woman of color, essentially. We're all people of color here, and then we're all women of color in some regard. And the marginalization is something that we are constantly trying to break through, and all of the victimization that we see at different levels. It's hard to even describe, because in the literary world there's a certain marginalization, and then there's marginalization that we overtly see in society that we can, and so, you know, we try to, those of us that have this privilege of being able to produce work and share it, there's a population of us that are still marginalized within this subset, and then we try to maintain a connection to perhaps a more grassroots level, where there are people in communities that are marginalized, women and women of color, who have even more harsher circumstances that they have to deal with. I mean, living situations even that are harmed by their race or their gender.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like we don't have an adequate language to talk about gender and biological difference. I mean, it's so rooted in these archaic notions that we need to reinvent in some way the very way that we discuss some of these ideas, I think.
Yeah, and it's funny because my ethnicity is not apparent, but I'm Jewish. And so when I was growing up, I grew up in a town in the US, actually, where Jews and blacks were both banned from all of the things like the sailing club and the golf club and all of that sort of thing. And, you know, we were frequently abused, and like Niloufar, I sort of, on that side, I'm very, very, I'm really aware of that growing up. And it's funny because people don't look at me and automatically know that ethnicity. I get a lot of things, people using really disgusting language, or, you know, I won't even go into it, but it's quite interesting. And so I hope, and I try very hard to be super sensitive to this. My experience, I lived for 9 years in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And that was in my 20s, in my early 30s. And it was so much part of my experience. So when I write about that, you know, because it was super important. And I don't write exclusively about that, but it's so much an important part of, but I'm very aware when I'm creating Chinese characters of what I'm doing, you know, and I'm thinking all the time about it. And you can't please everybody all the time. I mean, people are going to take offense at anything any of us do, that somebody is going to take offense for sure, you know, and you just can't worry about that. But it's, for example, with Mrs. Jin, I remember when I was younger, all of the novels written by, were pretty much written by white men about Asia, with things like Shogun and all these novels where there was this kind of exotic beauty, you know, this kind of exotic, amazing beauty who understood the main male, of course, white character, and helped him come into the culture and then be the hero of that main story. And so I was very aware of that, you know, particular thing, and wanting from an early age, before I had the chance to actually publish novels, I was working on fiction that wasn't published, but always thinking against that narrative and against the exoticizing narrative. And, you know, that's something which has always been quite important for me, because I am writing about people who are not me, but yeah.
Can I ask, Linda, in that community in the U.S., was there any solidarity between the African American and Jewish communities? Because I think dominant culture tends to mobilize one minority against another, right? And oftentimes it's a model minority versus, you know, which is not, of course, coming from us, but is coming from outside. So
exactly. No, I was like the civil rights movement, all this kind of stuff. You know, I was totally into it. And then the you know, some of the real harassment came from black kids in school, and I was like, but you know, I'm an ally. But you know, we didn't have those words at the time. But you know, I was kind of like, but and it also came from white kids, so it was pretty equal opportunity harassment. But you know, I was always very, very keen for that to be something that was a bridge and not, you know, a gulf. But you know, you live in particular societies and they work out the way they work out. And you know, it did get better.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to this?
Well, I just want to say that, you know, there's another part in my book where I do write about, you know, as an other writer, I'm always, or citizen, I'm always expected to sort of declare my identity, and identity politics is a really big discourse amongst everyone. I've always felt very strange declaring myself something, declaring myself Iranian American or female writer or something, you know, whatever the subcategories of human being are. So I've also had a resistance. It's two simultaneous contradictory feelings. It's at the same time wanting to stand up and declare my space against the matrix, the white male matrix there, but at the same time not wanting to be fetishized and not wanting to declare myself as these other subcategories of, you know, inhabitants of Earth. So it's sort of a mixed and very complex layer of feelings. And yes, there are these narratives. Many of these narratives are fed to us, as you mentioned, you know, Ravi, that set up groups against groups, marginalized group against marginalized group, because of course, God forbid that we should actually rise up against the real, 0.01% that determines everything in our lives and takes what we are owed. So of course, there have to be imaginary enemies built for us to fight against. For the white working class in this country, it's always the minorities and Mexicans and terrorists and Arabs and all these othered peoples that make really great headlines for people to commit their energies to. But I think it's venues like this and platforms like this that unite us, that we should all amongst ourselves champion more and more, so that we don't even need that matrix in order to commune with each other and to build our own audiences and our own and collectively come up with our own narratives, which is very difficult to do. I mean, even I think that these are sort of like mildly democratic, mildly liberal narratives that are fed. I watch a lot of people, in the political discourse speak, and I think that's not as radical. That what you just said, that narrative is not exactly as radical. It doesn't actually address the issue. It's just some sort of a beautiful Band-Aid over it, and it's sort of a little bit of a slogan. And I honestly feel like those narratives are given down to us by the conservatives, just to occupy us and put things in our heads and mouths with which we form our ideas and our structures. And I think that we need to rethink those structures. We need to really rethink those sort of moderate narratives. Those I suspect are just sort of handed down just to placate people and sort of create a little safe playground so that they have a safe place to wage war.
Yeah, and ultimately they're kind of false binaries, right? I mean, they're not really reflective of the complexity of the conversation in any way. All right. So we do have a question from one of our audience members. Deedle asks, have your writing habits flourished during lockdown, or have they been impeded? And I suppose I'll just add to that. How do you feel? I mean, isolation break now, we never thought when we got started that it would be going for a year. Here we are a year later. It was a pretty dismal year last year. Hopefully this will be a better year. But how have you been dealing this last year, and what's happened to your habits? Before we kind of went live, and Niloufar was saying that her habits haven't changed very much because she's like, isolation's okay. But I'm just curious. I mean, how have you all been dealing?
It was good. I mean, normally I'm so easily distracted. So if there's theater and there's cinema and there's parties and stuff like that, I want to be there. I'm that sort of person. But there wasn't. So we were in a very long period of lockdown in Sydney. But while we were, I got an awful lot done. It was great.
Yeah, I must say I'm.
go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Rhony. I must say, for me, it was. My concentration was absolutely shot. We had a very long lockdown here in Melbourne, and I found it was impossible. I just wasn't writing anything worthwhile. I did read a lot, though, but I find now as we can actually go out, I feel I need the contact of other writers, just to go out and have a glass of wine in the evening and have a chat for a while. I think that kind of gets my work going. I kind of need that. I found that I wasn't the introvert I thought I was, to some degree. I mean, this conversation, I just feel like it reminds me how much I love APWT. I just want to get on a plane and fly somewhere and meet up with you all.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to do that again. Rhony, you were going to ask something?
I'm sure Verena wants to say something. I just was going to say that the pandemic started during my first semester in the MFA program. And, the adjustment had to be made. And I was committed to finish the program in the 2 years. And I'm almost there, but we moved to virtual format. And my original plan was to visit museums. I was planning to go to the UK and tour all of the British museums and write poetry in response to the art. And of course that didn't happen. And also my local museum stopped they closed their doors. The day before they closed their doors, I rushed over there and spent about 3 hours taking photographs of all of my favorite pieces of art. So I use those in the program. But the other side is that I have listened to faculty members in my program do readings, and they've been collaborating with amazing writers such as Jericho Brown, all of the wonderful award-winning authors. And so that's something I would have never had been able to do during the MFA. And also just having Zoom chats with my classmates. It's just I have to make a conscious effort. I mean, it doesn't just happen. I have to commit to, okay, today, who am I going to talk to? Who am I going to interact with? So that I continue to be in that mind space where I'm writing and thinking about literature.
Verena?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so what you heard today was written during the lockdown. So in some ways, it has helped me progress with my novel. But unfortunately, lockdown has eased some time ago in Singapore. So over the past few months, life has gotten quite busy, and I'm struggling.
All right. Well, I'm just looking at the clock and I'm cognizant of the time. Wow, what an amazing reading and how quickly time has flown. So I think we're kind of getting close to the end, but I always like to leave everyone a little fortune cookie at the end of a great meal to open up. And so I would love for everyone to kind of just leave our audience with something that you're passionate about, something that you're reading, something that you're thinking about, something that you're socially active and engaged in, something that you kind of want to us to depart with after this wonderful banquet of voices. So, Jennifer, do you want to start and we'll kind of go around?
Yes, I'm currently working on an essay on the Libyan-born writer Hisham Attar. If you haven't read him, I highly recommend his work. It's absolutely wonderful.
And would you put that into the comments, his name, Jennifer?
Yes, I will.
Oh, excellent.
Yes.
Rhony?
I'm in my essay semester, and currently I'm working on an essay related to Dion Brand's work. It's an Ars Poetica, the verses that they had created. And along with that, I've moved away from using the word ekphrasis, which I took a class with Ravi years ago. But I'm moving away from that term, and I'm using pavika, which is what I feel like I'm doing, which is my imagination going into visual art and then moving through that into literary space.
Yeah, and would you say very briefly, Rhony, about what that relationship is? Because you're also quite an accomplished visual artist in addition to being a terrific writer.
Thank you. I'm creating some small collages every day, and what that is doing is it's helping me move from visual art to literary art. So by creating 2 or 3 lines of poetry as titles for those works. So the process of 3-dimensional creation versus the literary creation, it's 2 different things. So I try to meld those 2 during the day. And so I'm constantly thinking about materials, paint, color, and lines and patterns. And those somehow infuse themselves into the literary space.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Rhony. Verena, what are you thinking about? What would you like to leave us with?
I guess in this time where all of us feel that we are being limited in some way or other because of seemingly who we are versus what the mainstream seems to want, all I can say is keep doing what you're doing, because as I said in my poem just now, just don't let what people dictate you to, dictate what you behave. Flaunt your souvenirs and party till the lights go out.
Yeah, and it's so easy to feel alone and alienated, and hopefully things like ISO Break it's meant to kind of bring us all together no matter where we are at. So thank you so much. Niloufar, how about you?
Well, I teach a very popular course in undergraduate in an undergraduate situation, and it's completely online and asynchronous, and it always has been since I've been teaching it for years and years. It's called Writing and the Creative Process, and my students, each week I give them a different exercise in a different artistic form. So they're, 1 week they're writing self-portraits after studying self-portraits by the great artists. Sometimes they're doing homophonic translations and writing new texts based on their misreadings of texts they don't know. On and on. This goes on for many weeks. Different, sometimes they're writing synopses of opera, et cetera, et cetera. And this course is really very, very popular because I ask of them I don't ask of them to memorize anything. It's not a research course. It's just very unusual. And students absolutely love it, as painful as they sort of seem to find it in the beginning, because they're not used to sort of college courses being all about them and them discovering their creativity. So what I'm doing now is I'm thinking about ways to turn that course into a course for the general public. So I'm sort of taking the best of it, and I've now opened up the course. In the last week, they actually go out and do what I do for them. Their assignment is to interview 2 people in the community about creativity and how they're creative in what they do, whether they're fixing TVs or painting portraits or whatever, or if they're working in retail. So it's been very interesting to learn from that exercise as well. And I'm really excited to sort of find the best platform through which I can share this course and sort of igniting people's creativities just for everyone.
And are you still working in all of the interdisciplinary mediums that you usually do? I know you are do opera, you do all kinds of things, performance.
Yeah. I'm trying not to, because those collaborative projects take years and years, and I like to oversee. I like having complete creative control of my vision. So that means that I usually produce my own work, or I take charge of the bulk of it. So it just takes a lot away. And I have several books in me that I really want to bring out. So I'm trying not to do anything collaborative.
Yeah.
Hold me to that, please.
And Linda, how about you?
I'm torn between 2 things. One is telling you about some of the great books that I've read recently that I find really inspiring.
Oh,
so I'm reading both. Okay. So I'm reading at the moment Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown, and it breaks the novel. It's amazing, and it's fun, and it's wild. It's so interesting. He is a writer on Westworld, and he's written a novel in the form of a television script. And I won't say anything more, but Interior Chinatown I'm loving it. And recently, I was at the Adelaide Writers' Festival, because we've been able to recover writers' festivals in Australia. It was the most amazing feeling. And I got to interview some amazing, by coincidence, all of the people I was having conversations with were women writers. I was very happy. One was Maza Magiste, who's a writer from Ethiopia, who lives in the United States. And her The Shadow King is a really tough book, but an amazing book. Also from Australia, Sophie Laguna. And I'd heard about Sophie Laguna's books. They were also quite tough. They get into very difficult sort of confronting issues. And I think I tend to avoid that when I'm selecting books. I'm like, give me something that's funny, And I was so happy to be given Maza and Sophie's books to read, because you really need to read out of your comfort zone. My comfort zone being humor, not exclusively, but, and they were just such amazing books to have read. They stick with me. They're in my head. The other thing is, again, we're very, very lucky in Australia with COVID at the moment. We've seemed to have sort of, so we had a big demonstration on the 15th, which was a Women's March for Justice. and 10,000 of us marched in Sydney, women and allies, and it was phenomenal. It was just so exciting to remember that power of the collective and the importance of constantly being aware of issues, talking about issues, putting them right into the forefront of people's minds, getting them out there. And, you know, women just, we have a lot of things that we still need to do, and we need to do them together.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I'll just mention that the last really amazing book I read, Heather McGee's "To Some of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together." It's a quick read, but a very pragmatic look at how the history of racism has actually really hurt everyone economically, psychologically, emotionally, and it offers some pragmatic solutions on how we might change that. So that was a book I read recently. I was pretty moved by. And I want to, again, extend a great round of applause to all of these amazing female writers that were with us today. Thank you all so much for being with us. This is the first ISO break of the year. We will continue going every month. So I hope that you will join us. This has been a co-production of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. This event will be archived, will be available on YouTube and elsewhere, so you can share it. And thank you all for joining us and for contributing your work to this wonderful, for me, it's an evening, and for some of you, it's the morning, but regardless, it's been great. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
Ravi.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Take care,
Thanks.
everyone. Stay safe.